So today is China, China's engagement with the world then and more recently. Now, China boasts a civilization of some 5,000 years. That's debatable, but it's how they like to think of themselves. And like Egypt, China has one of the most continuous cultural traditions in world history that extends back thousands of years. There were a lot of ups and downs during all of that. You know that there were changes in dynasties, there were invasions, there were social and economic changes, but there has been a consistent Chinese presence in the world for a very long time. Now, since the 19th century, which was a very low point in China's history, since then, China has been viewed in the West as isolated and insular. Isolated out there in East Asia, not in much contact with the rest of the world, and insular in terms of being inward looking rather than outward looking. Now, historians have long understood that contrary to that notion, China has long had profound engagements with the world outside of China. However, the popular image of China as insular and isolated has persisted in the West. So it seems to me that now, as China is becoming a major global player, it might be useful to take a look at China's changing engagement with the world over longer periods of time as a context for understanding its recent emergence as a global power, which is very much engaged in the larger world. So we will begin.
Did not working. Let me click on it. Oops. How's that?
Here. We will begin with the Han Dynasty. The Han Dynasty was not the first Chinese dynasty, but it is the one that set the precedence for all succeeding dynasties. It ran the show in China between about 200 BCE and 200 of the Common Era. And it was during this time that some of the major elements of Chinese civilization took shape. One of them was Confucianism. Confucius was actually born 300 years or so before this, but his teachings came to be embodied as a kind of state ideology during the Han Dynasty. And furthermore, this famous system of Chinese civil service examinations got underway, which of course gave us bureaucracy, for which we are all grateful now. And if you have trouble with it, blame it on the Chinese. They sort of invented it. Now, during this Han Dynasty, China engaged in two major patterns of interaction with the larger world. The first of them has to do with relationships with what the Chinese thought of as barbarians north of the Great Wall. They were barbarians because they lacked cities, they lacked states. For the most part, they lacked agriculture, all of the things that were central to Chinese identity. But these so-called barbarians were drawn to China. They had a great desire for the luxury goods that China produced, silk, wine, agricultural products, and the Chinese, for their part, depended on these so-called barbarians for a number of their needs as well. They got horses, they got skins, they got furs, they got hide, they got amber from these northern barbarians. The result was, of course, a lot of trading across this boundary, this, the boundary being the Great Wall of China. There was a lot of trading, there was raiding, sometimes there was open warfare, sometimes there were periods of extended peace, but it was a major Chinese engagement and one that lasted long after the Han Dynasty ended. This relationship gave rise to two things. It gave rise to a system for navigating the relationship with these non-Chinese so-called barbarian people. And it was a system that has come to be called the tribute system. It was a system in which the foreigners, the barbarians, would offer tribute to the Chinese. They would acknowledge Chinese superiority. They would perform a series of ritual bowings known as kowtow. In fact, when I used to teach this, I would have my students perform the kowtow. I was, of course, the emperor. And I tried to get them to kneel, touch their heads to the floor, at which they did with some reluctance. There were times, however, when it was necessary for the Chinese to deal with these barbarians as equals. When the Xiongnu Empire here, the Xiongnu was a kind of quasi-state that some of these barbarian peoples put together, and they were able to fight the Chinese to a standstill, to force a more equal relationship for a time, and this was difficult for the Chinese to do, although they had little choice in the matter. The tribute system also embodied the Chinese view of themselves. They were civilized, the barbarians were not. They were self-sufficient. They didn't really need much from the outside, or so they said. They were superior, but they were willing to grant access to the barbarians and to allow them to become Chinese. So the Chinese sense of superiority was more cultural than racial. They acknowledged that other peoples could become Chinese if they studied Confucianism, if they dressed like Chinese, if they learned the language and so forth. They could, over time, become Chinese. So a second major engagement with the world during the Han Dynasty and later was this is an image of the kowtow, showing the foreign barbarian bringing a white horse as tribute to the emperor and bowing before him in this posture of humiliation. The Silk Road trading networks was a second major engagement with the wider world. It was a network of exchange that connected people all across Eurasia, from China to Europe to Eastern Africa. It began around 130 of the BCE era, and it lasted for at least 1,500 years. It was a commercial network. It was relay trade. That is, goods moved further than any individual merchant. There were these caravans that stopped at various resting points, caravanserai along the way, where they would exchange goods and rest and restock their goods. Now, silk was the major commodity, and that's where it got the name of this commercial network. Silk had originated in China, and for quite a long time, the Chinese more or less had a monopoly on silk production. But over time, various other peoples learned how to produce silk. Korea, Japan, India, Persia, the Byzantine Empire. Europe didn't learn it until much, much later. The volume of trade on the Silk Road was modest, and it was mostly luxury goods, goods that could be carried more readily on these camel caravans across a forbidding territory. And of course, more than goods made their way across this network. So too did religion. Buddhism was the main religion that traversed Asia along the Silk Roads. And here we have two images of it. This is a famous image that shows Confucius holding the baby Buddha in the presence of Lao Tzu, the founder of Taoism. So here is a striking image of of the non-antagonistic posture of these three major religious traditions in China. And this is a picture of the so-called fat Buddha or the laughing Buddha, which is a distinctive Chinese image of the Buddha. And of course, as you know, diseases also traversed these Silk Road trading networks, especially during the plague, the Black Death. Now, moving on. We'll pick up the story during what is sometimes called China's Golden Age. It was a golden age, certainly culturally, in terms of poetry, calligraphy, painting, ceramics, lacquerware, and so forth. The great Chinese poets that some of us have come to love have flourished during this so-called golden age of China. It was also a golden age technologically. The Chinese built very large-scale, almost industrial-style enterprises. They had an enormous iron industry, printing, navigation, magnetic compass, shipbuilding, gunpowder, paper money, mechanical clocks. Some historians, in fact, say that China came close to an industrial revolution breakthrough around 11 or 1200. Now, the Mongols sort of put an end to that, but it does look like China came close. And this image illustrates some of the major technological innovations. And that, of course, is an elementary sort of gunpowder cannon. But there was porcelain, movable type. That's gunpowder, magnetic compass, paper money, silk technology, of course. All of this contributed to a remarkable economic revolution in China. It became a highly commercialized society long before that occurred in Europe. People specialized in various productive activities, and there were something like 30,000 miles of interior waterways through which products could be sold on the market. And according to one Chinese historian, China during the Song Dynasty was far wealthier than any of its contemporaries. And this wealth, this economic and technological creativity is what enabled the population of China to more or less double during these 600 or 700 years. Now, all of this during China's golden age, all of this these internal developments were accompanied by an involvement with the wider world. The Silk Road, for example, brought many foreigners to China, and especially during the Tang Dynasty, all kinds of foreigners were welcome in China. There was a vogue for foreign fashions, food, music. There was an opening to a very interesting form of Christianity, of Nestorian Christianity, took hold and developed a unique set of religious texts that are now available in translation. Islam, Judaism, Zoroastrianism, Turkish and Persian culture were represented in China at the time. Buddhism, during this period of time, took more firm root in China. It was widely practiced. There were efforts to make it accessible to a Chinese cultural audience. There was state support for Buddhism, but what the state gave, the state could take away. And in the 9th century, there was a movement opposed to Buddhism on the grounds that it was a foreign ministry, that it was a foreign religion. And the state acted very sharply to disband Buddhist monasteries because they didn't pay taxes and they used up a lot of land. And they sent hundreds of thousands of Chinese monks and nuns back to private life where they would be subject to taxation. It did not destroy Buddhism in China, but it put a dent in it for a couple of centuries. This Chinese economic and technological creativity had a spillover for the rest of Eurasia, and many Chinese innovations spread widely, like papermaking, printing, gunpowder, and Chinese products such as silk, porcelain, and lacquerware found buyers from Japan to East Africa. Thousands of people, tens of thousands of people in Indonesia became dependent on the Chinese market for their spices. They became specialized producers for the Chinese markets. Culturally speaking, Chinese influence also spread widely particularly in East and Southeast Asia. Japan, Korea, and Vietnam alike adopted many aspects of Chinese culture. They adopted Confucianism, court rituals, administrative systems, city planning techniques, Confucianism, of course, Buddhism, artistic and literary styles. But for the most part, these places retained their political independence while making use of Chinese cultural and technological innovations. Now, somewhere around early 1200, the Mongols invaded China. And China was a part of the empire building activity of the Mongols, who created, with fewer than 1 million people, the largest empire the world had ever seen to that point. And China was the chief jewel in the crown of the Mongol Empire. It was, however, an enormous shock to many Chinese. Now they were being governed by those they considered barbarians. That rule was harsh, it was exploitative, and it was foreign. They did not want the Chinese, the Mongols did not want the Chinese to learn their language, and few of the Mongols learned Chinese. So there wasn't a lot of cultural back and forth. Marco Polo, it turns out, was in China during this time when the Mongols were governing it, and he observed that for many Chinese, they felt like they were being treated just like slaves. They would seize women at will, they would extort officials for what they wanted. On the other hand, the Mongols were sometimes praised because they brought unity to a China which had been divided. And one element of the Chinese sense of themselves is that China was naturally a unified state, and any disunity was unnatural. So the Mongols were given credit for returning China to a unified state. And the Mongols themselves tried to rule as much as possible like good Chinese Confucian rulers. In fact, they gave themselves a dynastic title. They called themselves the Yuan, which means something about a new beginning in Chinese history. However, it didn't last all that long. It lasted about 200 years, a little less actually. And by 1368, the Mongols had left China and went back to Mongolia. The Ming dynasty that followed tried to turn against all things foreign, and they wanted to return to a much more traditional Confucian-based tradition. But they also launched, the Ming dynasty also launched between oh, I forgot. I get going and I forget the slides. This is Marco Polo kneeling before the Chinese emperor, and this is an image of the battle that gave rise to Mongol control. But back to the Ming dynasty and its voyages. The Ming dynasty, although it sought to get rid of all foreign influence, nonetheless, for a period of about 25, 30 years, launched an enormous maritime voyage into the Indian Ocean. You can see on the insert map there where their ships went. This was an enormous enterprise. There were 7 voyages between 1405 and 1433. On the first voyage alone, they had 300 ships, some 27,000 people aboard these ships. All of these voyages were led by a very tall, apparently about 7 foot tall, Muslim eunuch named Zheng He. His voyages visited major ports in Southeast Asia, Indonesia, India, Arabia, and the east coast of Africa. The goal of these voyages was to establish Chinese power and prestige in the Indian Ocean basin, and to enroll a number of those societies in this tribute system. They did not, however, seek to conquer territory. They did not establish Chinese settlements, and they did nothing to promote Chinese culture or religion in the areas that they visited. It is interesting to compare these Chinese voyages with the European voyages that occurred at the end of the 1400s. 1492, Columbus came to the Americas. A few years later, Vasco da Gama got to India around the bottom of South Africa. But it turns out that all of the ships of Vasco da Gama's voyage and the 3 ships of Columbus could fit on the deck of one of those Chinese huge vessels. Now, the interesting difference between the Chinese voyages and the European voyages is that the Chinese voyages abruptly ended, and they did so deliberately. They were not forced to, they were not required to leave, they had overwhelming power, they could have established a maritime empire in the Indian Ocean basin. But when the emperor, who had commissioned this vast expedition, died, his opponents came to power. They thought that the voyages were useless. They were more worried about the barbarians to the north. They didn't see any danger coming from the Indian Ocean. And if they did want anything from those societies, there were others who would bring it to them. So they simply cut off the voyages. Those ships were allowed to rot in port. Even the memory of those voyages was largely lost until more recently, when in the context of Chinese growing global presence, the Chinese themselves resurrected Zheng He as an image of the kind of peaceful engagement with the larger world that they were imagining that they were replicating. This is actually a postage stamp that celebrates those voyages of Zheng He. The European voyages, on the other hand, did not stop and were not stopped, and they went on to transform the world. But it's interesting to imagine what would have happened if Vasco da Gama had sailed into the Indian Ocean and met up with this kind of an armada from China. It's one of these interesting what-if questions. If the Chinese had decided to continue their voyages and had encountered Vasco da Gama's ships and blown them out of the water, one wonders how things might have been different. This is counterfactual history. So the Chinese turned their back on a maritime empire in the Indian Ocean, which was easily within their reach. But in the next dynasty, they established a land-based empire. And during the Qing dynasty, from about 1680 to 1760, this was Ming Dynasty China, they enlarged their society in Tibet, Mongolia, Manchuria, and vastly increased the geographical size of China as they engaged in a land-based empire building that was parallel with what was happening in the Ottoman Empire and the various European empires in the Americas. Now, this land-based empire was motivated by defensive concerns. They were worried that the Mongols were stirring again. They were worried about the encroachment of the Russian Empire. So this was a kind of defensive empire building. It vastly expanded Chinese territory. It added a large number of non-Chinese people to China's population. And in world history terms, it ended permanently the incursion of barbarians into China. So China was now free of a threat from the barbarians across the Great Wall. Soon, however, they encountered the barbarians of the sea, the Europeans. For about 300 years, between 1500 and 1800, European missionaries and European merchants engaged with China. The missionaries were not very successful, and once it became clear that they would refuse to allow the Chinese emperor to monitor their activities, they were expelled. The merchants also were very limited. They were allowed to practice at one port, Canton, and under strict Chinese control. So for 300 years, they engaged with these European barbarians and thought of them in much the same way as they had thought about the barbarians to the north. But by the 19th century, things had changed and the Chinese had not known it. What had changed, of course, is that Europe was industrializing. And that changed everything. And that change became apparent in the 1840s in what the Chinese know as the Opium Wars. The issue was opium. For much of this 300 years before the Opium Wars, the Europeans were hard put to find something that the Chinese wanted to buy from them. They wanted a lot of things from China, but they did not produce goods of sufficient quality or need for the Chinese at that time until opium. It turned out that there was a great market for opium. The Chinese had known about opium for a long time, but European trading companies began importing it in large numbers, in large amounts. And this created a terrible addiction problem in China. Millions and millions of Chinese became addicted to this stuff. It broke Chinese laws, which largely forbade its import, and it created rampant smuggling. And so in 1838, the Chinese emperor summoned a council of people to give advice on what to do. Should they crack down on this, or should they accommodate it and try to control it better? The emperor opted for a crackdown, and he sent a well-known official known as Commissioner Lin here to Canton with orders to crack down on the opium trade, and he did. In the first place, they seized a lot of opium from the Europeans who had it in their storehouses, and they flushed it into the sea, as this picture shows. Before they did so, however, they warned the fish to leave, that they were putting this poison into the ocean. They apologized for doing so, but said it was necessary, and they prayed for the fish. To the Europeans, their private property had been taken without compensation, and this was an offense that they were no longer willing to tolerate. The result was the Opium Wars. There were, in fact, two of them. The first one was in the 1840s. The second one was in the 1850s. And the result of these conflicts was the military humiliation of Chinese forces. They simply had not reckoned with what the Europeans, with the military technology that the Europeans had been able to construct. And their ships were blown out of the water. It also resulted in what the Chinese referred to as the unequal treaties. Chinese were required, at the point of a gun, essentially, to a series of humiliating treaties. A whole series of ports along the coast of China were now opened, required to be open to European merchants. The Chinese government was required to not only permit the missionaries to act, but to protect them while doing so. Europeans patrolled, they sent their gunboats up Chinese rivers, and China was essentially carved up into a series of spheres of influence. Now, China was not colonized directly like Africa was at roughly this time, but the British, the French, the Russians, the Germans, and the Japanese all carved out spheres of influence in China where they were given special economic privileges. In fact, the British required the Chinese to avoid using the term barbarian when it applied to them in documents. The Chinese term for Europeans had been a term that meant barbarian or savage, and now they were not supposed to use those terms. And so the Chinese found themselves carved up like a pie. This is Queen Elizabeth, German Kaiser Wilhelm, the Russian Tsar, the French, and the Japanese. They all participated in this carving up of China. The Americans benefited too, although they didn't get a sphere of influence. They were for an open door policy in China where everybody could exploit China equally.
Bob, can you tell us which countries refer to the different colors? Because it's, I'm just
Let's see,
curious.
I believe, I can't.
It's blurry, isn't it?
Well, the French took over Indochina and they had a sphere of influence in South China. The British had the bigger one. The green is Japanese. The Japanese took over Korea and Formosa or Taiwan at this time, and they became Japanese colonies until the end of the Second World War. And the Russians got a sphere in northern China. No, I think the blue is British. Yeah.
Thank you.
There are images like this as the Europeans carved up Africa as well, although in Africa it was not just spheres of influence, it was formal territorial conquest. Now, wait. The Chinese have long made the communist Chinese have long made a big deal of this. A few years ago, the president of China, Xi Jinping, said this: several centuries ago, China was strong. In the over 100 years after the Opium Wars, China suffered immensely from aggression, war, and chaos. The Chinese refer to this as a century of humiliation, from which they were rescued by the Chinese Communist Party. And so the Chinese Communist Party has used the Opium Wars and this century of humiliation as a justification for their policies. But it was an enormous reversal of fortunes for a China that had this image of itself as the Middle Kingdom, the Celestial Empire, the greatest civilization in world history. This century of humiliation, of course, climaxed in World War II with the Japanese invasion, which caused terrible suffering, 15 to 20 million casualties. And it ended, the century of humiliation ended only with the victory of the Chinese Communist Party in 1949. So now we come to the more recent period of communist China and the world. The coming to power of the communists created a major change of fortune in terms of China's relationship with the world. The Communist Party had led the resistance to Japan within China, far more than the Kuomintang under Chiang Kai-shek. Immediately after the communist takeover in 1949, they entered the war with the United States in Korea, and they essentially fought the Americans to a standstill in Korea. By 1964, they had begun to acquire a nuclear arsenal, and during this time, China's major international engagement was with Russia or the Soviet Union. It was useful for communist China to have a nearby ally who was likewise a communist state, and they borrowed a great deal from the Russian model. They tried to industrialize, at least initially during the 1950s, along Soviet lines with a major industrial and with the creation of a modern industrial society. They also followed the Soviet model of collectivization of agriculture, although they did it much more peacefully than the Russians had done. And this picture over here shows a close relationship between Stalin and Mao, illustrating that alliance. By the mid-1950s, however, that alliance had broken down, and China and the Soviet Union came close to war. There were rivalries over who would be the leading communist power. There were Soviet fears that the Chinese were a little bit crazy and what would they do with nuclear weapons? So they stopped giving nuclear aid to the Chinese and abruptly withdrew the nuclear advisors and stopped sending uranium to China. This growing split between the two communist powers, of course, opened the way for Nixon's visit to China in 1972, in which he, of course, sought to take advantage of this split to have what he referred to as a détente in the Cold War. Now, during this time, under Mao's leadership, China largely withdrew from the world economy. They refused to join the World Trade Organization. Their trading relationships were largely with communist states. They raised the funds to industrialize and to modernize their agriculture, largely from within by taxing their own people. So Chinese development under Mao's leadership in the 50s and 60s and early 70s was self-financed. They did not depend on, they did get some help from the Soviet Union, but for the large part, they financed it out of their own resources. Now, Mao died in 1976. And what followed, as you know, were major economic reforms that introduced element of a market economy, of a capitalist economy. The result, of course, was stunning economic growth, 10% a year for decades on end. The World Bank claimed that it was the fastest sustained economic expansion by a major economy in world history. It was a remarkable economic transformation. And it meant new prosperity for many people. It meant better diets, higher life expectancy, lower child mortality, declining poverty, and massive urbanization as millions of people flocked to the cities. This, of course, was what Mao had feared. Mao's Cultural Revolution of the 1960s was because he thought that the Communist Party was taking the capitalist road, as he put it. He was right. And it is one of the most amazing paradoxes of modern Chinese history that the introduction of capitalism in China came at the hands of the Chinese Communist Party. Mao must have been spinning in his grave. It is what he feared, it is what happened, it is what came to pass. Now, as part of these economic reforms, China rejoined the world economy. They welcomed foreign investment. They set up all kinds of what they call special enterprise zones along the coast where foreign investors were given special privileges. They became a major manufacturing power. Chinese goods, as we know, flooded the world. Their high-tech achievements in electric cars, solar energy, artificial intelligence have been very substantial. Here are some of the accomplishments of that effort. Alibaba is apparently the world's largest retailer. There is a big Chinese airline. Smartphones, I didn't realize that this Didi was a ride-sharing giant that rivals Uber. They are one of the largest gaming, they produce much of the world's gaming technology, and they have the largest bank in the world. Internationally, this also had registered. The Chinese initiated what they called the Belt and Road Initiative. It was a multi-trillion-dollar infrastructure project that built roads, ports, railroads, pipelines, and investments in 151 partner countries, and gave the Chinese a global economic footprint. And so all of this, by the early 21st century, got a lot of people talking about China, the Chinese century, in a way that people had referred to the 19th century as the British century and the 20th century as the American century. And so the question has been repeatedly raised whether the 21st is going to be the Chinese century. The Chinese recently have hosted both the Summer and Winter Olympics. They have an expanding and high-tech weapons project that has given them geopolitical dominance in Eastern Asia. Clearly, they are one of the world's great powers now. Now, the reaction to that in China was, well, of course, China is returning to its accustomed position as a dominant major civilization in the world after 100 years of humiliation and backwardness and poverty. And all of this was thanks to the policies of the Chinese Communist Party. Xi Jinping recently said China was a mighty force moving closer to center stage and making a greater contribution to mankind. So from the official Chinese point of view, this was a natural return to China's earlier powerful and in some ways, a dominant position in the world. Elsewhere, however, the reaction was rather different. In our country, it is anxiety. China has become one of the major rivals and perhaps a menace to US interests. In 2019, a Defense Department official said that the greatest long-term threat to the US way of life was China. And of course, Trump sees China as an economic and geopolitical rival, and one that has been ripping us off as well. And he is setting out to end that. For the European Union, this rivalry, this new rivalry now between China and the United States poses a real problem. How are they to navigate this? How are they to retain their alliance with America while dealing with an up-and-coming Chinese economy? For developing countries, of course, they welcomed the support that the Belt and Road Initiative has offered to many of them. It freed them from complete dependence upon the West for their economic development projects. On the other hand, it has also made many of them fear indebtedness to China and dependence on China. Now, all of this raises, this is no longer history now, this is the future. These are the questions that all of this raises, or so it seems to me. Is the global balance of power shifting to Asia and China away from Europe and North America? If so, how might a Chinese-centered world be different from a British or American-centered world? If this transition is underway, what kind of conflicts will it engender? Will it engender a hot war, a cold war, a trade war? Or maybe this is not quite what is happening. Some people suggest that what is happening is not moving toward a Chinese-centered world, but a multipolar world in which there is no single dominant power, but rather a series of major powers like Europe, the United States, Russia, China, and India, with a number of regional powers, like Iran and Turkey in the Middle East, Brazil in Latin America, Indonesia in Southeast Asia, Nigeria in West Africa. So I will leave you with these questions as to the next phase of China's engagement with the world. But these are some of the questions that it raises. So let me stop here and see if you have comments of your own or questions that I probably cannot answer. So here.
Yeah, I have a question about modern China with them adopting so much capitalism. Has their energy production stayed centralized and socialized, and banking and healthcare? Those are three areas where it's reasonable to think about a coordinated central control rather than individual capitalist competition.
Gary, I am not sure about how centralized the banking system is. Industry has been substantially decentralized. The state still occupies a prominent position in the Chinese economy, but they have encouraged state enterprises to behave as if they were capitalist corporations. That is, they need to make a profit. They can't depend on state subsidies, although a number of industries still are subsidized by the state, which is something that the United States complains about. But, and there have been a whole series of innovative industrial arrangements that they refer to as, I'm forgetting the term. It's an alliance between a local industry and a local government that has it is a kind of state capitalism, of which we have some as well, but with more state than we are likely to want to entertain.
I imagine healthcare is still government run.
Healthcare is, I think, much less. I just am not sure, and I'm not sure if I'm mixing up what happened in Russia with what happened in China. The Chinese, under the Cultural Revolution and the earlier Great Leap Forward, had initiated a very innovative healthcare system using so-called barefoot doctors to treat common ailments, using oftentimes Chinese medicine as well as Western medicine. And that sharply reduced endemic diseases in China. Many people have argued that these new economic reforms have brought back some of the evils that the Chinese Communist Party had wiped out earlier, such as prostitution, gambling, gangs in the cities, and this kind of, and of course, corruption is a massive problem, and the Chinese government has sought to crack down on corruption within the Chinese Communist Party. Other thoughts? Or yes,
Can
please.
you comment on the Chinese control population and her families preferring boys than girls?
I'm sorry.
Can you comment on the Chinese control of population
Oh,
and
yes.
that the families were preferring boys than girls?
Well, it wasn't the communists that were preferring them, it was Chinese culture that preferred them. The communists tried to, the communists in fact enacted, as I think I mentioned in a talk some time ago, quite radical feminist policies to get women more engaged in the workforce, to end this gender discrimination. Now, in terms of population control, the Chinese government, even during Mao, began to realize that their population was getting out of control, or at least that's what they claimed to believe. And they instituted this one-child family policy, which was very coercive. It had an army of people going in to inspect whether women were having their periods and whether they were using birth control devices, and sometimes in virtually enforcing them to become sterilized if they had more than one child. It was a very coercive policy. Now, more recently, that has been abandoned, and the Chinese are back to sort of a two-child family. But there are a lot of children that were born during this one-child regime that are now largely responsible for their parents' well-being in their elder years. But they have sharply reversed this now. They have opened this up. I'm honestly not sure how far, but the one-child regime is over.
So when you spoke about nationalist spheres of influence, you know, what about multinational corporations, these giant corporations without any sense of nationalism, just their spheres of influence, will they grow without any sense of nationalism?
Well, the spheres of influence took place during the 19th century, and it benefited the large Western corporations because they had pretty much free reign within their sphere of influence. Now the situation is quite different. When the Chinese opened up their economy after Mao died, a large number of global corporations set up shop in China, partly because environmental controls were looser, wages were lower, regulations were less restrictive. So there was an influx there. The Chinese have been wary of too much because they remember the 19th century and they don't want to allow these corporations to to run the show too much. And in some ways, they have cracked down on it. Just recently, of course, the Chinese government has enacted controls on these rare earth elements. And I guess last week, Trump and Chinese president have come to some sort of an agreement that they will buy more soybeans and loosen up on rare earth elements, and we will not be so crazy about tariffs on Chinese goods. And most people seem to be interpreting this as essentially a Chinese victory. That Trump has been bested, that he hadn't quite realized apparently how dependent the American economy is on these rare earth elements, of which the Chinese control somewhere around 90%. So that gives them a considerable leverage. And
the oil production, it says China's a big, huge oil.
oh, yes, it is. Yes.
So the influence that the oil producers have with Iran, anybody that will sell oil to them?
I think that the Chinese are producing their own oil. I don't think it's
It's mostly Russian. Mostly Russian. Russian oil goes to China. And the natural gas.
Russian oil.
Yeah.
Okay, so they are buying oil from.
Yeah. All the oil that used to go to Europe now goes to China.
Okay. But the Chinese have also invested massively in green energy. Much of their economic development has been powered by fossil fuels, whether it comes from Russia or from within China. But they have also, at the same time, massively invested in solar energy in a way that the United States seems to be backing away from.
And wind also, Bob. Wind also. A lot of the wind generating technology is Chinese.
Okay.
The big, the largest of the propellers are pretty much Chinese.
Okay. And a lot of the solar panels too, I gather.
Almost every solar panel that we use here in the United States is manufactured in China.
With the batteries?
Batteries is a mixed bag. China does manufacture a lot of batteries. There was a big effort in the first decade of the 2000s to begin battery construction here in the States. And I don't know what the distribution is of domestically manufactured battery, modern battery compared to imports. I think it's probably a little bit more batteries are manufactured here than are imported from China. But we cannot make a battery here in the United States without importing the rare earths that Bob talked about. They all come from China. There is no source here domestically or anyplace else in the line. It all comes from China.
And what can you say about the, through all these massive transformations in China, what has been the fate of the profound classical traditions, say in poetry, music? I know theater isn't your, but poetry, we know it's the longest continuous poetry tradition in the world, And what has been the fate of that? I'm sure it's gone up and down, but do students still get that grounding in classical language and poetry that they did, which is so connected to spirituality?
Yes, I wish I knew, honey.
Yeah.
Question.
He's still learning poet, memorizing Lipo and all that in the Chinese school. I have a Chinese friend, but she's maybe in her 50s and grew up in China, and she says they used to recite the Tang Dynasty poets in the schools.
Okay, maybe we'll know more once we talk to our friends who have
Yes.
just returned from China. When I was teaching in New Zealand, there was a fellow in the department who was married to a Chinese woman, and they had a little beautiful Chinese baby who they were teaching
Yes.
these poems to, and I found it amazing that a little 2-year-old could speak Chinese.
Oh, my God. That was the first thing he was learning. And he was
Yeah,
so young, and she was teaching him.
Yes.
poems.
Of course, during the Mao era, they tried to do away with a lot of this traditional, especially, or they adapted it to Communist Party politics. Now, it is true, I think that, well, Confucianism has made a rebound here. There are hundreds of Confucian institutes in China that practice the study of Confucian texts. So Confucius has outlasted Mao. And religion in general has a much freer hand. In fact, Christianity has grown very rapidly in China in the last 50 years or so. Some of it in more or less state-controlled churches, but a lot of it in independent house churches that meet more or less carefully to avoid too much inspection by the authorities. So those elements of Chinese culture have rebounded after Mao. How much that applies to the classical poets?
Yeah, I see that the troops, the dancing troops, you know, and the people singing with the wavers and
Yes.
the acrobats, they still flourish. That's an old thing, is it not?
I think that is a fairly modernized and maybe even westernized.
That's all for us.
They claim a Chinese ancestry, but it's a pretty commercialized.
Bruce Lee Kung Fu.
Check it out.
Well, thank you so much.
Thank you.
By the way,